We have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case after all of these weeks, and if you thought that was the only major decision of the day, you would be wrong. We're going to talk about what happened on this absolutely monumental.
Diddy breaks down in the courtroom, and it's not just emotional, it's historic, as the judge handed down a brutal prison sentence that even his harshest critics didn't see coming, turning this into more than just a legal decision.
Guilty. Sex trafficking of Jane, not guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Cassie, guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Jane, guilty. That was the historic verdict out of the Sean Diddy Combs criminal court today. A split verdict after almost 13 hours of deliberations and weeks of testimony and evidence and arguments. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the more severe charges, the ones that carried the stiffest prison sentence, potentially 15 years to life in prison, but convicted him of the Mann Act charges, which, by the way, carry up to 10 years in prison each, although I will tell you in a filing today from the government, it appears the sentencing range they're looking for is 51 to 63 months, so 4 to 5 years. However, there is no mandatory minimum. So would the judge go lower? We'll talk about what the defense is asking for too. And also, whatever the sentences are, would he combine the sentences consecutively, one after another? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of questions, but I'll tell you what, you would think that the verdict would be just the only big part of today. You would think that's the only major decision. Not the case, because we got to talk about what happened later on in the day, the bail hearing. Right after the verdict, it was a question of should Sean Combs be granted release while awaiting sentencing, which the judge set today, by the way. Sort of set the sentencing date. I'll talk more about that as well. But I mean, let's talk about Sean Combs. He's been locked up since September 2024. He's been denied bail at each turn. There was a change of circumstances here. He had just been acquitted of 3 of the charges. So could he make bail? We're going to talk about it. All right, so to discuss the hearing and more, let me bring on once again, hopefully not for the last time, but we're at basically the end of this case until sentencing, joined once again by long crimes in court reporter Elizabeth Milner. Great to see you. First of all, your reaction to the verdict. Is this what you expected? Because let's really briefly explain what happened yesterday. That, you know, we thought it kind of gave us a preview into what would happen today. Not necessarily so.
Yeah, I was not going to lie, Jesse, a little surprised by the verdict in that I really kind of thought there was a really strong case for count 2, that obviously being sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie Ventura. And that was only because of the questions that the jury was asking when they were bringing some notes back. And that was kind of in relation to what had happened at specific instances that the government point out were allegations of sex trafficking. So I thought because of the tone that was inside the courtroom, the way the family was getting a little bit emotional sitting inside the gallery, even Diddy's demeanor, for the most part, we've seen him kind of really keep up his spirits. But yesterday was really a time where we kind of saw, I think, the weight weighing in on him, that it's possible a conviction on some of the more serious charges were going to happen. And so when the jury came back not guilty on count 1, 2, and 4, you know, I was a little surprised, especially to count 2. But, you know, I do respect the jury's decision. They spent a lot of time listening to this case, listening to all the testimony, listening to all the evidence, and that was the verdict that they had rendered.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised that they found him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. We have been saying since for weeks on this show that felt like a straightforward path to conviction. Wasn't surprised not guilty with Jane, given some of the gray areas of her testimony, but also the jury didn't even ask for one readback of her testimony or anything to do with her testimony, so it made me think they might have already been decided there. I was surprised about Cassie Ventura sex trafficking just because, like you said,
this is a thunderclap across the entertainment industry, the justice system, and the culture itself. The fall of a giant unfolding on camera under the lights in real time, with a sentence so harsh and unforgiving that it blew past predictions, crushed expectations, and landed squarely in the realm of legal shock. The room went silent, no one moving or even breathing, while in the center of it all Diddy sat frozen in disbelief, until the weight and finality sank in, his eyes lowering, his hands trembling, his jaw tightening, and finally the tears falling. Quiet, heavy, and final. It showed a man who built an empire, a mogul, a brand, a force, now brought to his knees, not by rivals, not by financial collapse, not by fading music trends, but by the justice system, the same system he once seemed to outmaneuver.
They came back yesterday and said, we have a verdict on that charge. So I thought they're convinced. And when it came to racketeering, I thought they were still going to be hung because they said they were at an impasse yesterday. It seemed like based on their note, there was no way that would change. The judge told them to continue deliberating. They come back today and like in an hour, they come back not guilty on racketeering. I'm not really sure what that split ultimately will be. Maybe the jurors will speak out and we'll hear. Got to ask you about Diddy's reaction. Okay, so we have courtroom sketches of what it looked like. You were in there. What was his reaction to the verdict?
Oh, he was very pleased with the verdict. Obviously, I think for the defense and the defendant, that being Sean Combs, I think obviously they would have wanted an acquittal on all the charges. But I think given that they weren't a conviction on the more serious charges of RICO conspiracy and sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie in one charge and Jane in another charge, I think overall Combs was very, very pleased with the jury to the point where I saw him kind of mouth a little thank you to the jurors as they were still sitting kind of in the jury box, as they were kind of leaving for the end of their day. Obviously, we still have some more matters to address for our end. But in terms of just his reaction, even his family's reaction, Jesse, I think they were so happy knowing that there's such a strong possibility that their father will come home. Obviously, if he would have been convicted on the more serious charges, that might have been a different discussion. But given that he was only convicted on count 3 and 5, that being the Mann Act, it seems like given that it comes with a lesser penalty and sentencing, I think the family is like, yes, our father is coming home, our loved one is coming home, and we hope to see him very, very soon.
And talk about a reaction. Outside that courthouse, my gosh, what has been going on out there? There's verbal disputes, people spraying things. What is just, give us a brief summary of what you've witnessed outside that courthouse after the verdict.
I witnessed a lot, Jesse. A lot was going on. There was kind of, I will even say, pandemonium after the verdict was read. And outside, a lot of Diddy supporters, a lot of people who are kind of with the Free Diddy, I wouldn't say movement, but I guess, they believed in his innocence. They were very pleased, even thinking that it was a possibility he'd just walk outside of that courthouse at some point. But it was a lot of commotion. I did see some people getting to some heated debates, especially in relation to Cassie. I saw some people getting very upset because they believed that the government was trying to take a good man down who did a lot for the culture. Those types of conversations were being had from a lot of people in the public. I even saw some kind of weirder things, and that being people squirting baby oil on themselves. And one of the reporters even got some on her shirt by one of the people who were kind of over in that area. And so a lot was going on to the point that I think the courthouse police were just kind of like, okay, we need everybody to calm down. They have barricades going all the way down the street. I think in the event that Sean Combs would have walked out of that courthouse, it would have just been straight chaos, I think, outside. But for the most part, especially with that not happening around that time frame, that a lot of people, especially...
And now the system has him locked tight in its grip, refusing to let go, with the courtroom packed full of reporters, spectators, family, and lawyers who came expecting a long day of arguments, but instead witnessed a sledgehammer of a sentence delivered with cold precision and zero hesitation. The judge read the terms without pause, without softening the blow, and when the final number dropped, the air was sucked out of the room with gasps, murmurs, and raw disbelief. Diddy broke in that moment, his shoulders dropping as he leaned forward, like he'd been struck, unable to hold himself up. No cameras were allowed, but the sketch artists captured it all: the emotion, the collapse, the unraveling of a man who once ruled everything. His lawyers tried to speak, tried to comfort him, but he couldn't respond because the verdict had landed and there was nowhere left to run. The sentence turned out longer than any prediction, harsher than any leaked draft, leaving even seasoned legal experts stunned.
That we all watched, that's horrific. All of that should have been prosecuted as state crimes in Los Angeles. That as a fundamental, starting point.
Well, they couldn't do it now. It was time barred.
No, of course, the statute is run on everything.
Yep.
But that would have been, he would have been prosecuted for exactly what he did instead of predicate acts into a RICO theory. Now, RICO, as we know, was designed for essentially mafia organization, for organized crime. And the idea is simply because there's a there's a legitimate business, like in The Godfather, they had a legitimate olive oil importing business, and that was but it was still a criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that. And the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole thing started. And and the jury, this was a sober jury that the questions were serious and direct. And, they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning saying, hey, this guy's not deliberating. And so this was a serious group. And the Mann Act, they did convict on that. So they were, by the fact that that it was unanimous meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have, they draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rules. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote. And you tend to get a more serious class of juror in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just like the sex trafficking, sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape. Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here, especially when you're talking about all these people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And that was a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? What's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages, the conduct that arguably contradicts someone being a victim, and I know there's complicated factors between an abuser and a victim, the trauma, I get it. I totally understand.
Prosecutors themselves look stunned, because this wasn't just a victory for the state, it was a warning, a declaration that even the most powerful can fall, and fall hard he did. Outside the courthouse, chaos exploded, protesters shouting, fans breaking down in tears, reporters rushing to go live, everyone scrambling to process a moment already cementing itself as history. 1 second, it was just another courtroom proceeding. The next, it was the collapse of an entire legacy. The brand, the image, the empire, all shattered in a single brutal stroke. Inside, the judge made it clear this wasn't personal but judicial, citing the evidence, the damage, the repeated pattern, the lack of remorse, and the need to send a message not just to Diddy, but to the entire industry and the world. Justice doesn't flinch. And through it all, Diddy sat silent, offering no resistance, no outburst, just taking it. The weight of his downfall pressing him into the reality that there was no way out.
It was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were: serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this, because again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used, or that fraud was used, or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution. payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule,
it was pure devastation. The man who built Bad Boy Records, who danced on stages worldwide, who turned his name into fashion, media, and business empires, now stripped down to nothing more than a case number in a courtroom, just another defendant, awaiting transport. Nothing could make it more real than that. The silence around him said it all. His team offered no press statements, no spin, no defense, only stunned quiet. Because what do you say when the system drops a hammer that heavy and the client you fought for is walking out in cuffs? And this wasn't performance, not for cameras or sympathy, it was collapse, complete collapse. Those inside the courtroom described it as one of the most emotionally charged moments they had ever seen. Some compared it to historic trials. Others said it felt like watching a king stripped of his crown. His body language told the rest of the story: slumped, defeated, eyes bloodshot, breathing heavy. It wasn't just sadness, it was the crushing realization that this was real, that the empire was gone, and there was no coming back.
And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency suite that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action.
No more negotiations. No more PR. No more damage control, just prison. Real prison, for a long time. The fallout hit instantly. Projects canceled, sponsors gone, labels scrambling, and associates cutting ties as everyone who once benefited from Diddy's rise now distances themselves from his fall. Calls go unanswered, emails ignored, contracts ripped up. No one wants to be linked to a sinking ship. Legal experts are already calling this a precedent, a turning point proving that celebrity no longer shields you, because the fame that once worked as protection now acts like a spotlight, and once the system turns that light on you, there's nowhere to hide. Social media is in chaos, some mourning, some celebrating, some saying justice was served, others arguing the sentence was too harsh, but no one denying the impact as timelines erupt with reactions, live streams, and breakdowns of every detail. And while the world debates, Diddy sits in a holding cell, stripped of everything, no entourage, no assistants, no tailored suits, just a jumpsuit, a number, and a future now confined behind bars. The system doesn't care how many awards you've won or how many hits you've made when the gavel drops. It drops the same for everyone. The judge made sure the world heard it loud and clear. Now the only question is what's next. An appeal will almost certainly come, but not soon. Appeals drag on for months or even years, and this sentence is active now. Diddy is already locked away. As for why the court came down so hard, the answer was laid out plainly. The judge didn't just see the case. He saw a pattern: arrogance, denial, a refusal to take ownership, and when the court sees that, it doesn't hesitate. It corrects it. And this correction wasn't about fame, it was about principle.
The jury was able to see some messages from Jane to Sean Combs where she says, "I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma. On 2 of my birthdays, you forced me to perform with with entertainers." Then the jury was able to hear, these audio recordings, some that we've already heard before, where Jane is saying, "I want you to know," and then Sean Combs kind of cuts her off and he says, "Are you recording me? What are you talking about?" Kind of showing these different instances where it turns out she was being recorded, but that Sean Combs in a way was kind of playing it like, oh, maybe he's manipulating her because he's implying that she's recording him when truly she was the one that was being recorded on. And so then they kind of talked about after Cassie's lawsuit where Jane's relationship with Sean Combs changed. She stopped seeing him for months, but the government points out that Sean Combs told Jane to charge him. They kind of imply that it was to buy her silence because Jane had asked for about $100,000 per year that they were together for her loss of money and her time, plus what she had to endure for these hotel nights, and kind of pointing out that charging was significantly less than what Cassie ended up getting in her settlement with Sean Combs after she filed her lawsuit. But in terms of just threats that were made too, the government point out that Sean Combs threatened to release her sex tapes to her child's father, and that the government says that Jane reached out to Christina Quorum about the threats, and that she again didn't speak with him for about 2 months after he had threatened to release these sexually explicit videos and photos of her to her child's father, and that they ended up reconnecting around her birthday, which is in February of 2024, because Sean Combs says that they would spend wholesome time together. Lo and behold, that an escort was being contacted by Sean Combs so that way they could do another hotel night. So those were just some of the instances of sex trafficking by Jane. But in terms of just all these different instances of specific sex trafficking, they point to the sobriety party of October of 2023, where Jane wanted to do a hotel night without drugs, and then she ended up throwing up in between escort number 2 and escort number 3. They also point to the June 18th, 2024 incident that happened at Jane's house, where she was physically assaulted. And then at the end of it, when she said she was forced to do a hotel night even after being assaulted, Sean Combs said something to her saying, "Is this coercion?" And I think the government was really kind of pointing out that coercion was the specific word that Sean Combs used. And so those were just some of the instances of alleged sex trafficking as it pertains to Jane.
Yeah. And that goes to knowledge. That goes to the knowledge component, because the defense is going to say, how was he supposed to know they didn't really want this? Well, if the jury believes that he said that to her, that's significant. And I have to tell you, I think the highlight from this day,
it was about protecting the system, about proving that justice doesn't bend even under the weight of millions of eyes. And for Diddy, that reality came crashing down in the most public and painful way possible. The news spread across the globe. Every outlet, every continent. Diddy sentenced, Diddy breaks down, Diddy taken away. It stopped being a headline and became history, a permanent stain on a legacy that once felt untouchable but is now cracked, crumbling, maybe finished. This moment will be studied for years in law schools, in documentaries, in hip-hop history books as the day the empire fell, the day the mogul met the judge and lost. And those who once thought they were untouchable are now watching closely. Because if Diddy can be brought down like this, anyone can. This wasn't just a trial, it was a warning. The silence from the defense team spoke volumes. No statements, no spin, just shock, because there's no way to polish a collapse this raw. Even Diddy's silence said more than words ever could. No excuses, no bravado, just the face of a man who finally saw what was ahead of him, a cold cell, a locked door, and the sound of everything he built collapsing behind him. This is what happens when the system catches up, when the fame fades, when the truth lands, and when the sentence hits harder than anyone imagined. Diddy's breakdown in that courtroom was the final image, the reminder that no one, not even a king, is above the law. This may not be the end of the story, but it is the end of the illusion and the beginning of something far more real.